Oh guys, today is the day we're going to compare the ZV-E10 original, my little Dougie, to the brand new ZV-E10 Mark II that I so expertly reviewed. And rest assured, you can still look gorgeous in either camera. However, there are some substantial upgrades with the ZV-E10 Mark II, and oddly, a couple of downgrades. So I'm going to have some test footage, I'm going to have some side-by-sides, some statistics. What else would you expect from a reviewer of my caliber? So let's get right into it. So first, let's talk about the differences in the body. And the great news here is that the ZV-E10 Mark II is not much bigger or heavier than the original ZV-E10. In fact, without the batteries, it's actually lighter than this camera, which is kind of crazy. So the extra weight, the extra few grams that you get on the ZV-E10 Mark II, it's because it has a bigger battery, and that is much better because you get a bigger, nicer, beefier grip to hold onto, and you have much longer battery life. The new body does feel a little more premium, and you also have the on-off switch up by the zoom rocker, and you have a switch mode for the photos, video, and S&Q as opposed to a button that is on the ZV-E10 original. The microphone is also upgraded on the ZV-E10 Mark II, and it has the best microphone in any of the Sony cameras. So if you want to vlog or just use the microphone without any actual external mics, then the ZV-E10 Mark II is the best you can do in the Sony lineup. Now, I would always use an external microphone, whether a lavalier or a shotgun mic, something like that. But if you want to use an on-camera microphone that is actually built into the camera, the ZV-E10 Mark II is really good. They both come with that little furry wind muff, that Don King wig that goes on top there, and that can really cut down on the wind noise. It's essential, in my opinion, if you're going to go out into the world. The SD card slot, thankfully, is moved to the side on the new ZV-E10, whereas the original one had it in the battery compartment, which is always a chore, especially if you're on a tripod, something like that, or a gimbal. Trying to change out your SD card is a real pain in the butt. You have the same ports on both cameras, but they are more conveniently located on the ZV-E10 Mark II, so your wires don't get in the way of your screen quite as much. And also the USB-C port is much upgraded on the ZV-E10 Mark II. So you can now do 4K 30 streaming from that USB-C, whereas you can only do 720 streaming from the ZV-E10. I'm glad there's some kind of streaming on this camera, but really, if you want to start streaming in 4K, you are going to have to use the HDMI port and use a capture card for the original ZV-E10. The fully articulating screen is much better on the ZV-E10 Mark II. Not only does it have a better resolution, it has 1.04 million dots versus about 900,000 dots on this, but it's just the actual contrast. The image itself looks so much better on the new one. With the original one, you just kind of had to trust. If you were in sunny weather mode, you kind of had to trust that the image was going to be fine because it looked blown out on the screen no matter what exposure setting you had it at. The new one is much easier to judge your actual exposure on the screen itself, and I think that was a very needed upgrade. And that screen not only has better resolution, it is a much more useful screen because it is fully touch enabled. You can't actually touch the menu screen on this one. Well, you can touch it, but it's not going to do anything. You have to use the buttons to navigate through your menu system, if you can believe that. Now, you can touch to focus, touch to track, or touch shutter with the ZV-E10 original, but you actually can't scroll through any of the menus. And the new ZV-E10 Mark II that also has swipe menus. It is a very functional, very well laid out menu system that is fully touch compatible. That is worth the upgrade for many people right there. And obviously in that new body is a new sensor, the same sensor that's in the A6700 and the FX30 that you're looking at right now, which is wonderful for people who want to get FX30 quality on a budget. Then you can get it in the new Mark II 26 megapixel sensor. This one right here in the original one is a 24 megapixel sensor, and you can only go to 4K 30 with this guy right here, whereas with the new Mark II, you can go all the way to 4K 60. There is a small 1.1 times crop, but it is 4K 60, and both cameras will downsample from 6K, except in the 4K 60 mode, that is downsampled from 5.6K, but it is 6K in 4K 30 and down. Same with this one right here. And that new sensor is capable of 10-bit 422, so much more color information. You can get millions of colors on the ZV-E10 in 8-bit, but on the new one you get over a billion colors. So when you want to use S-Log3 and get full dynamic range and be able to color grade to your heart's content, the ZV-E10 Mark II will let you do that, just like the FX30. Now that being said, the image quality on this camera is still absolutely fantastic. So let me show you some side-by-side images of the ZV-E10 with the ZV-E10 Mark II, and you can see for yourself. Now, I think in the 4K modes, this holds up extremely well, even though it is 8-bit footage. There are many situations where you won't notice the difference between 8-bit footage and 10-bit footage, and most of the things I shoot are those types of situations. You're doing studio shots, you're walking around vlogging, you don't necessarily need the 10-bit, and you can still get wonderful image quality out of this camera right here at a much cheaper price. But when it comes to the 1080 footage, the ZV-E10 Mark II definitely has sharper 1080 footage, which also means the 1080 120, if you're trying to do 120 frames per second, you have to do 1080 on both cameras, so it's going to look better on the ZV-E10 Mark II. And of course, that camera has 4K 60 and this one doesn't. Now, what about stabilization? Neither camera actually has an IBIS system, in-body image stabilization. They save costs by leaving out the IBIS, and they just try to do it electronically. And the ZV-E10, the original, crops in 1.44 times in active stabilization, a very hefty crop. And the new one still has a pretty hefty crop. It's 1.33 times, so definitely less of a crop. However, it is still a substantial crop. So if you want to do something like vlogging, I would recommend the Sony 11mm f1.8. But even though there's not a giant gap between the two crop factors, it is the actual stabilization, the electronic stabilization, that I think is much better on the new version of the camera. So let me show you some vlog footage right now and you can see for yourself. And now we are on my favorite lens for vlogging, the Sony 11 f1.8. Check this out. Look at this nice comfortable field of view. Even if I hold it by the camera, you still have a pretty good field of view, even with that active stabilization, which definitely works quite well on this new camera. Check this out. Look at this, walking around, talking my nonsense, filming my gorgeous face while a bunch of people scream over here. So here we are on the original Sony ZV-E10 with the 11mm from Sony. It is still certainly usable with this camera, even with that active 40% crop for stabilization, because this lens is so wide. Once again, if I was holding it by the camera, it would be borderline too close, but it's a wide lens, so you can get away with it. But with this little selfie stick out here, definitely very usable. Still, it's nice to have that wider field of view on the new Mark II. This is the ZV-E10 Mark II, just on the kit lens, and I'm using the active stabilization. So if you have a little selfie stick like this and you extend it out a little bit, then I think this is actually pretty doable for vlogging. I would still prefer the Sony 11mm 1.8 for this to have a more comfortable field of view, but still, this is pretty nice. This here is the ZV-E10, the original on the kit lens. Bit too tight for vlogging, I think, and even though I have the selfie stick extended out further, if I didn't have this selfie stick, it would be right about here, which is definitely too tight. If you extend it out this far and then push your arm out further, then, but now I am like extending my arm fully here, so I think that that is a little too difficult, and I never use the kit lens when it comes to vlogging for the Sony ZV-E10, because this active stabilization, it crops in too much on this particular model right here. I am using the internal microphone right here, but that's it. Here you go. That is the comparison to the old versus the new. Now, I certainly thought if you're going to use active stabilization, you're much better off with the Mark II version. However, you don't have to use active stabilization at all on either camera because they both have gyro data. You can record the gyro data right to the SD card and then smooth it out in post with Catalyst Browse, which is free, Catalyst Prepare, which is a paid program, and also GyroFlow, which is another free program. I just use Catalyst Browse for free, even though you can't do the 10-bit footage with Catalyst Browse with the new ZV-E10 Mark II. I find it's fine for me and my vlogging situation. So often I will use that gyro data and smooth it out in post. Now that does take a long time. Be warned, that is not an easy process. It takes a lot of computing power and it takes a fair amount of time, but I believe the results are worth it. But you can also eschew all of those things and just simply use a gimbal, a tiny, small, lightweight gimbal. Let me get one. I actually got two. This is the Zhiyun Crane M3S, tiny little lightweight gimbal for mirrorless cameras, and this is the Crane M2S, which is even smaller and lighter. And this will take the ZV-E10 Mark II or Mark I with the 11mm or the kit lens. Let me show you that now. Now, of course, you could always go get yourself a little gimbal and not have to worry about much at all. This is my smallest, lightest weight, and cheapest gimbal, the Zhiyun Crane M2S. It can handle the ZV-E10 and the kit lens just fine, along with a little ND filter that I have on there and a microphone pack. Don't have to worry about your steps being too heavy or too light, and you just get nice, smooth footage as you walk around society, talking your nonsense. So if you don't mind carrying around and balancing a gimbal, then you can get a very wide field of view with the 11mm, and you can also even use the kit lens to vlog on the original ZV-E10 or the Mark II. Another reason the handheld footage looks so much smoother with the Mark II versus the original is the improvements to rolling shutter. Has the same rolling shutter on the new one as the A6700 and FX30, and that is somewhere in between an A7S III and an A7 IV. It is definitely a good enough rolling shutter, something around 16 milliseconds of rolling shutter of the ZV-E10 Mark II, whereas the original one, it's atrocious. It's as bad as it gets. The rolling shutter, the jello effect, if you're moving the camera around. That's why I did like to use gimbals or Catalyst Browse with this guy, because if you are using active stabilization, you have to be nice and smooth if you don't want to see that jello effect. Now, if you're just putting it up on a tripod, doing studio shots, things like that, no worries. Or like I said, gimbal or Catalyst Browse. Now let's talk about that new kit lens for a second that comes with the Mark II versus the original kit lens, and it is much less noisy. It is very smooth to use, whereas the old one, it rattled around a lot, and the old one, as you zoomed, you couldn't keep focus tracking, whereas the new one can. The new one can also keep up with very high frame rates of Sony cameras, whereas the old lens can't, and it has a new optical stabilization as well, so it's going to be a smoother lens when it comes to actually stabilizing your footage. Now, I didn't see a ton of difference between the two lenses when it comes to actual optical quality and sharpness. However, the new kit lens is definitely an upgrade over the old one. Another improvement on the Mark II is there are no crops at all, except, as mentioned, the 4K 60 has a 1.1 times crop. On the ZV-E10, the original, there is a small crop in 4K 30. And also, there's a couple of quirks, like you will lose your eye detect autofocus if you are connected to an HDMI monitor and you're using 4K 30. 4K 24 is fine on this camera, but 4K 30, you will lose your eye detect autofocus. Also, if you're connected to the PC remote function on this camera, once again, you will lose your face and eye detect autofocus, and it will go to a center-based focus. And in that same vein, when you use clear image zoom on the old version, you will once again lose your eye and face detect autofocus, and it will go to a center-based autofocus, and that is a big advantage, I think, because clear image zoom is very useful on the new camera. You can keep your good autofocus and then extend your lenses. You basically get more reach out of every single lens that you are using with almost no downside at all. And the Mark II has many other upgrades to the original, such as S-Cinetone. It also has the Cine Vlog mode, so you press one button and it will make it look a little more cinematic for your vlogs. Switch it to 4K 24 with the S-Cinetone, and you can have a bunch of other automatic modes that you can slide around and adjust these automatic modes with your finger, and you can get just better footage coming straight out of the camera. You also have that great new focus breathing compensation, which can jive with compatible Sony lenses, and you have focus mapping, which I find very useful when you are trying to obtain critical focus. But that being said, the original ZV-E10 is still an excellent camera and actually has some advantages over the Mark II version, if you can believe it. Well, the first one you could believe, and that is the price. This one here is $698 when it's not on sale, and sometimes they put it on sale for $598. So body alone, $698 for the ZV-E10 original, and the new camera is coming in at $998. And that is a big price jump. I can understand it with all of the ability that the new camera has, but you can definitely get Little Dougie for much cheaper. And as I have shown, the image quality can be absolutely stellar, indistinguishable at times with this camera and the new version. And the original ZV-E10 is probably a better photo camera when you consider the fact that this one has a mechanical shutter. They took out the mechanical shutter to save costs on the ZV-E10 Mark II. This one can shoot 11 frames per second mechanical shutter. You can only do electronic shutter with the Mark II, which is also at 11 frames per second. So when it comes to taking photos of things that are moving fast, a lot of times you will get curves in your lines, like say a golf club. When it's being swung, you may see a big bend in it when you were shooting with electronic shutter, or if you're taking a photo outside of a moving car and you see the signpost that is curved, that is the electronic shutter. The rolling shutter is trying to read from top to bottom, so you get a curve. You are not going to have that with mechanical shutter. And worse than that, I find, is banding. So if you are in an environment where you have different LED lights flickering at different speeds, then sometimes you can see these different shadow lines going through your photo, and that is the banding, and you can eliminate that using mechanical shutter. So if you're trying to take photos of, let's say, a wedding and there's all these lights everywhere, different LEDs, there is a variable shutter, and you can try to dial it in on the ZV-E10 Mark II, and that will help, but you'll have to actually find the frequency that will get rid of those lines. Now, when you're shooting outside, a lot of times that won't be a problem, but definitely a mechanical shutter is much preferred from photographers. When it comes to low light performance, both cameras are actually pretty good. In fact, a lot of people will prefer the ZV-E10 original because this uses more aggressive noise reduction from what I can tell, whereas the A6700, FX30, and now ZV-E10 Mark II, it doesn't use as much noise reduction, so you are free to reduce it yourself. In post, they give you that, but you'll get a less muddy image because it's not using such aggressive noise reduction. But the ZV-E10 is no slouch. It's always been great in low light. The new camera will also have a dual base ISO, at least that's what I found in my test. If you're using S-Log3 and you switch over to 2500, you will see that noise dropping right there like the FX30. So that's another good thing if you want to use S-Log3. Number one, you can use 10-bit. Number two, use that next ISO of 2500. You can't do anything like that on the ZV-E10, but just taking it out, using it in standard picture profile, walking around, you are going to see that this thing competes very mightily with the new camera when it comes to low light. So I think for a lot of people, the extra cost will be worth it when you consider all of the things that you're getting with the Mark II, the 10-bit 422, the 4K 60, the better rolling shutter, the better stabilization. You get 4K 30 USB-C streaming. It's just a better screen, touch, fully touch functional. It is just an excellent camera, but you do have to pay substantially more than the ZV-E10 original. And as you can see in this video, you can still get excellent image quality out of this guy. And if you're willing to use Catalyst Browse when you're doing handheld footage, or use a gimbal, or maybe you're just using it as a studio camera, and then you want a better photo camera with a mechanical shutter, the ZV-E10 is $698. And like I said, sometimes discounted to $598. So Dougie is the bargain acquisition of the century here on the Sony lineup. And they are still selling this camera. They know how popular it is, and it's a great entry point for people into the Sony system. So they will continue selling their best selling camera, which makes a lot of sense, but they will add in the ZV-E10 Mark II for those people who want an upgrade. So tell me down below, do you think the extra cost is worth it of the ZV-E10 Mark II, or would you stick with little Dougie right here? And I wouldn't blame you one bit. He is a hell of a camera, and you are a hell of a person for sitting around and watching me right to the end. I appreciate it. We'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.